Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're putting on our detective hats to decode the internal logic of chronic lateness. If you've ever blamed traffic when, let's be honest, you actually just couldn't find your shoes, well, this one's definitely for you. We're going to discover exactly why your brain might literally prioritize its own internal drives over the ticking clock. So, have you ever noticed that some folks are always late, even when they genuinely intended to be early? It's almost like their brain sees time through a completely different lens. Or, hey, maybe you're that person. Have you ever started getting ready like 2 whole hours early, only to find yourself frantically tearing the house apart looking for your keys the exact second you were supposed to be walking out the door? It's a deeply frustrating experience, right? But here's the thing, it's not random. All right, here's our agenda for today. We're going to start with the chronic lateness mystery, move right through time and optimism bias, explore the one less thing trap, look at relying on adrenaline, resisting the clock, and finally, decoding your brain. Let's get into it. Section 1. The chronic lateness mystery. More than just disorganized. Okay, so the common myth out there suggests chronically late people are just lazy, disorganized, or even disrespectful. But actually, the reality is quite different. Their brains are often just following a super predictable cognitive loop. It's an entirely internal standard that operates on its own strict logic, totally divorced from the actual ticking of a clock on the wall. Moving on to Section 2, Time and Optimism Bias, the trap of the perfect scenario. So a lot of latecomers struggle heavily with something called optimism bias. This is basically your brain consistently underestimating how long a task will take because it fixates exclusively on the ideal, perfectly frictionless version of events. It's kind of like people who overthink success and get trapped in a perfect planning phase, completely ignoring the real-world effort. The chronically late brain plans for a perfect world that, frankly, simply doesn't exist. Let's put that into perspective. Your brain quickly calculates the flawless scenario. Oh, it only takes 10 minutes to drive there, right? But it completely fails to account for the messy reality. Hitting literally every single red light, endlessly circling the block for parking, and then the physical walk from the car to the actual building. So your brain isn't necessarily ignoring the clock, it's actually just doing the math for a flawless reality. Which brings us to Section 3, the one last thing, craving the dopamine reward. Picture this. You are fully prepared to leave. But right before you walk out the door, you spot a stray email, or maybe a few dirty dishes in the sink. Suddenly, out of nowhere, you feel this massive internal pressure to fix it. Why? For a quick dopamine hit before you transition to a new environment. And the result? Yep, you end up leaving 5 minutes late. So, why exactly do we do this to ourselves? Well, it's because that one stray email or those dishes mocking you from the sink, they stay highly active in your mind and cause actual, genuine mental discomfort. You rush to fix them simply to get a quiet sense of relief. Essentially, you're prioritizing the internal relief of task completion over the external rule of being on time. You're deliberately making yourself late in the process just to soothe your brain. Crazy, right? Section 4. Relying on adrenaline. The pressure of the clock. Our sources highlight something absolutely fascinating here. Their brain might need the stress of the clock to shift into problem-solving mode. Think about that for a second. Some people actually struggle to focus or even physically move when life feels too comfortable or predictable. Just like some folks thrive in major emergencies but struggle with mundane daily chores, the chronically late brain uses the sharp panic of being behind schedule as a necessary tool, like a jumpstart, to finally force itself to take action. And this adrenaline reliance doesn't just come out of nowhere. It happens because constant overthinking, analyzing every step, every outcome, every tiny possibility of your day, leaves your daily mental energy completely drained. By the time you actually need to leave, the simple act of walking out the front door feels like a massive transition. Your brain actively resists switching from one mental state to another, so it waits for the adrenaline rush of being late to finally push it over the edge. All right, Section 5, Resisting the Clock. Subconscious power plays. It turns out some individuals are fiercely guided by internal standards. This resistance to imposed structure is a massive piece of the puzzle. If you highly value your autonomy, a strict appointment or a rigid external schedule can genuinely feel like a loss of control. So what happens? Your brain initiates a sneaky subconscious power play to completely reject that external system. You essentially subconsciously resist the rules to restore your sense of choice, You end up preferring to arrive on your own terms, even if it literally means being late, rather than succeeding by blindly following a rigid external system. It's a truly fascinating way the mind prioritizes its own internal drive for freedom over the external rules of society. Which leads us to our final section, Section 6, Decoding Your Brain, Shifting the Narrative. Recognizing these cognitive patterns proves one incredibly important thing. You aren't broken, and you aren't inherently disrespectful. Your mind is simply wired to prioritize internal drives, things like the need for autonomy, sensory processing, and dopamine, over rigid external clocks. Lateness is often just a predictable coping mechanism for all of that. And honestly, understanding this specific cognitive loop is the absolutely crucial first step toward making real, lasting change. So, now that you've successfully decoded your brain's internal logic, I want to leave you with this. How are you going to use this insight? Once you recognize your lateness as a cognitive loop, how will you finally bridge that gap between your mind's unique timing and the rigid clocks of the outside world?